The house was built between 1841 and 1845 for a very wealthy landowner by the name of Christopher Turner. Now, Christopher Turner made his money through land ownership, and in 1841 he had 27,000 acres of land, and his annual income was £21,000 a year. This house actually cost in the region of £50,000, but the overall bill was in the region of £60,000 because he lavished at least £5,000 on the gardens. Now, when you come into the mansion, we have the Grand Hall, and we suffered a devastating fire in 2005. Now, the architect for the property was a gentleman called William Byrne, who was a prolific Scottish architect. Now, I mentioned Byrne was the architect. The fire I mentioned was on the 25th of January, being Byrne's night. So the fire took hold and destroyed the majority of the public rooms on the 25th of January 2005. The restoration period was a 3.5-year rebuild at a cost of £12.5 million. During the fire investigation, the staff were interviewed by the fire brigade, the insurance company and the police to ascertain what caused the fire. Unfortunately, the damage was so severe there was no forensic evidence available to point us in the direction of the cause. Now, it's been speculated that it may have been electrical. Well, we're fairly sure it wasn't, because we had all our electrical testing carried out in the October to the December beforehand, and we were able to present all our certification to the insurance company, and they were satisfied, and they paid the entire £12.5 million bill. Now, some of the features in the house were destroyed, but they were replaced by expert craftsmen. And anybody coming to visit, they really must look at the ceiling, particularly in the Grand Hall, the library, the Rochford room and the Turner room, because those were all replaced. And basically, a couple of days after the fire, I came into the burnt-out area, and I was given a big immersion suit, a bit like the Royal Air Force use for the helicopter crews who rescue people out of the sea. So I came into the building wearing this enormous protective suit, and my job was to rescue artefacts like the plaster mouldings which had survived the fire. Now, these are absolutely soaking wet with firefighting water, so they were put to one side, bagged and tagged where they were found. They were then frozen in a mobile freezer unit, and they were taken away by the experts to use those as a basis for making a new mould. We were very fortunate that the original drawings for the house were lodged in Lincoln Archive, so when the restoration team came in, incidentally it's the same team that did Windsor Castle, and they were absolutely brilliant, and they really did know their trade and their expertise. So they used the original drawings and the pieces of plasterwork that were salvaged to make up new block moulds. And when the moulds were actually manufactured, they all arrived on the back of a low loader, and they were all in about 8-foot by 6-foot boards, which were brought in, and they were then on battens, just turned upside down, screwed into place. But the absolute workmanship, when you look at the ceiling now, you would never tell, because there are absolutely no joins whatsoever in the plasterwork where this has been rebuilt. The fireplace is Ancaster stone, and the main fireplace is a feature of Byrne. Now, Byrne was influenced by a gentleman called Dieterling, and it's known as a Dieterling-esque fireplace. And again, it's got a couple of supporters which look a little bit like Neptune. We're not sure. The family has absolutely no connection to the sea as far as we can establish, but they're just a bit of fun, and they are very nice supporters holding up the fireplace. The central figure, it's an animal, and I know he looks a bit lion-esque, but I know he's actually a ram. And this ties in very nicely with the land ownership connection to the Turner family, so it's a little reminder of how he made his money. The fire started in the roof and worked its way through the successive floors, and it eventually broke into the Grand Hall and destroyed the majority of the Grand Hall. Now, the biggest problem we had was the poor fire brigade couldn't get through to fight the fire in a timely manner. There was a contraflow on the A1 and the fire engines were stuck in the traffic. The firefighters tried everything they could to go via the back roads to get here as quickly as possible, or fighting their way through the traffic, but unfortunately it took them over half an hour to get here from Grantham. But when they actually did arrive and started to fight the fire, they worked like Trojans. Each fire engine contains, I believe, about 400 gallons of water, and that was very quickly used. So they had to send for a hose laying truck from Gainsborough, and they laid a kilometre of hose to supply the water from the lake at the hall to fight the fire. We do have a ring main, and that was energised from the lake, and they were able to initially fight the fire using that ring main. At one point we had 24 fire appliances and 300 firefighters tackling the blaze, and they came from far and wide all over the county. Later on in the day, the fire brigade sent out a request for a Simon snorkel, which is a platform device, so they can get up above the height of the fire and then play the water onto the fire from above. But that had to come from Lincoln, and again it had to fight its way through the traffic. The hose layer had to come from Gainsborough, that had to fight its way through the traffic. So they were really up against it, but they did a marvellous job saving what they did. One of the methods they employed was using a device called a monitor, which is basically a big clamp that holds a fixed hose branched back to the river, and he had a high volume pump pumping water from the lake and the river up to one end of the house, and that was played onto one particular end, and that stopped the fire spreading any further into the area known as the Oak Room. Now, the Oak Room is the only public room to survive the fire, but we'll talk more about that one later. When we go into the Turner Room, I laughingly call this the Rogues Gallery, because this is where the family portraits are. Unfortunately, we don't know who they all are, because over the years the records have been lost, but we can identify one particular gentleman as A. Christopher Turner, who is a relative of the man who built the house. And there's another picture we have positively identified, a gentleman called Major Christopher Brooke Turner, another member of the family. Unfortunately for the Turner family, the gentleman who was going to inherit the property, also a Christopher Turner, was killed on the battlefields of Flanders in October 1914. This meant the house then passed to Herbert Brooke Turner, who didn't actually live in the house, but leased it out, as he preferred to live in the village of Ponton. He is on display in the Turner Room, and he is wearing his First World War medals. He's got the Mons Star, the War Medal and the Victory Medal, but leading the row is a military cross, because he was an officer serving with the 17th 21st Lancers, who were the local regiment for this area. You'll recall I mentioned the damage to the plaster ceilings. Well, as we go into the library, this again has been completely rebuilt, and very interestingly, we have a little face of Sir Isaac Newton looking down upon us. He's the only little face in the ceiling. He's very small, but the connection to the Turner family and Sir Isaac Newton is that the Turner family added Woolsthorpe Manor to their property portfolio in the 1700s. So that's a nice connection. Also at the top of our driveway we have an obelisk, and that is also dedicated to the memory of Sir Isaac Newton, who incidentally went to school in Stoke Rochford parish initially, and then as he grew up he went to the grammar school in Grantham, and he apparently walked there and back each day to go to grammar school. Also, as we look at our library, there were approximately 10,000 books in the library. We lost every single volume. Fortunately, there was nothing of any great value, because it had been used as a book repository for the National Union of Teachers. The NUT were absolutely marvellous, because when we came to restock our library, they put out an appeal for hardback books around all the schools, and with their efforts and efforts from local well-wishers, we soon replenished our library, and that's the library you see today. Now, the bookcases, or what I call all the boring stuff, the carcass and the shelving, that was all done on a machine. But it took 1,000 man-hours to program the machine, and it took 1,000 man-hours to actually rebuild the library. But the escutcheons and the decorative feet and all the nice decorative work was all done by hand, so that is a really nice piece of workmanship. If you go into the library, you'll normally find it's full of furniture. But I'd like you to imagine all the furniture stripped out, so you've got an empty floor. I usually ask our guests when we go into the library what happened in September 1944. I get various answers. Oh, it's a Battle of Britain, or it's D-Day, end of the war, whatever. But actually, it was the anniversary of the Battle of Arnhem. The 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, was stationed here immediately before going to Arnhem. And in our collection of photographs, we have a lovely picture of the officers from the 2nd Battalion on the steps of Stoke Rochford Hall, taken on the 15th of September 1944, just 2 days before they go to Arnhem, where the operation known as Operation Market Garden was a plan to drop 10,000 paratroopers by glider and parachute behind enemy lines at the strategically important bridge of Arnhem. The idea was that a whole series of bridges across Holland would be captured by the paratroopers. They would then be relieved by the ground forces of 30 Corps, and that was the Garden element, and the airborne element was Market. So our American allies would capture a series of bridges of Song, Grave, Nijmegen and several others, but the prize went to British airborne of Arnhem. The operation was expected to last 3 days. As most people know, it went disastrously wrong, because if they've seen the film A Bridge Too Far, our boys were cut off, 30 Corps were unable to punch through and relieve them on the bridge, and in the end, of those 10,000 men that went in, less than 2,000 came home. Adjacent to the library is the orangery. Now, basically, the orangery is a great big greenhouse. It's called an orangery because they literally did grow oranges, lemons and pineapples. Now, some of the glass in the orangery is the original 1845's rolled Victorian glass. And when you look at it, if you move your head from side to side, you can actually see it shimmer and ripple, and that tells us it's the original stuff. But nowadays we use the orangery to hold weddings. And the interesting thing there is we can provide a complete package, because the bride and groom will be married in the orangery, they have their wedding breakfast in the library, and then they have their party and disco in the grand hall, and of course the bridal suite's upstairs in one of our very nice bedrooms. So we can do a complete package here at Stoke Rochford. Nowadays, of course, we are a hotel, and the orangery, as I mentioned, is used for weddings. The library, the Turner and Rochford rooms are used for Sunday lunches, and those are available from our website or through phoning into Stoke Rochford. Also, we've found very, very popular have been murder mysteries, and they are quite an experience. And the author of the actual plays, each one is unique, so it's not just something we've looked off the internet and got. The guy actually comes in, and incidentally he's an ex-paratrooper, and he took me to one side and wanted to know all about the Arnhem connection when he came to visit us. One unusual feature we have, so that anybody inside the house can communicate to people coming to the front door, are 2 speaking tubes. And these little brass tubes are exactly the same as you'd have on board a ship for sending instructions down to the engine room for more steam, or to turn the ship to port or starboard. So you can talk into the tubes, and the one tube goes outside and the other tube goes down to the butler's pantry, so that they can send instructions to the butler to say that a gentleman has arrived at the front door. The kitchens were significantly altered over the years, but historically the kitchens used to be one wing of what is the old stables courtyard. And ironically, they were kept separate just in case there was ever a fire, so it wouldn't damage the mansion.
So how did the food come over?
Very interesting. They would prepare the food in the main kitchen, and then the shape of the house, it's like a lot of little squares joined together, and they would cloche it up, and they would then run along the corridors with the food, and then they would deliver it to a finishing kitchen where the food would be reheated before serving it to the family in the grand hall. And at one point, when we have some lovely photographs from Mr McCorkadale's collection of a great big refractory table in front of the main fireplace of the grand hall. A couple of Christmases ago, I was approached by a gentleman who had a private library. He phoned me up and said, we've just discovered Dora's diary. I thought, well, Dora? Dora was one of the Turner daughters. Now, Christopher Turner and his wife had 13 children, and Dora was the last daughter. And unusually for the Victorian or into the Edwardian period, she kept a diary. And various things have come out of this diary, and one of which talks about living in the house. So they've agreed to get the diary transcribed, and when they do get it transcribed, they're going to send us a copy, and we can then use that as living history of what it would have been like to have lived in a magnificent house as a young lady growing up. Tragically, Dora died at the age of 23 in childbirth. Just thinking about Dora's story there reminds me of Algernon Turner. Now, Algernon also kept some notes, and one of the stories that he recalls is that all the servants in the house were all selected for their stature, all being 6 feet in height. They would be clothed in livery jackets in blue, embroidered with white lions, and they were to wear red plush trousers.
I heard once that the head of the household would always call his male servants James, just because he didn't know their real names, so it was always James. If there were 10 Jameses walking along, they would each be James. And I wondered if that was where the song Home James and Don't Spare the Horses comes from.
That's a lovely story. I've got no details on whether or not the Turner family called their servants James.
But it's a nice story.
It's a lovely story.